Hey everybody, this is John the Other, and you're looking at a picture of a man named Ivan Henry and his two daughters. This is an older picture of him from the 1980s with his two daughters. In 1983, Ivan Henry was charged with 10 serious sexual offenses against 8 different women in Vancouver's Mount Pleasant neighborhood, which is where I live. Mr. Henry was photographed in a police lineup with a group of other men who bore similar appearance to him, as well as with 2 uniformed police officers in that lineup. And these 2 uniformed police officers held Mr. Henry in a headlock while the picture was taken. This is the picture. And this is the photo from which the alleged victims of the sexual assaults that Mr. Henry was charged with identified him from. A photo in which a group of similar-looking men stood at ease, and Ivan Henry was held in a headlock by 2 uniformed officers in 1983. Mr. Henry was 36 years old, and he had at the time suffered from a history of mental illness. In his trial in 1983, Ivan Henry did not have an attorney and represented himself. The Crown prosecution took advantage of Mr. Henry's lack of legal expertise, and arguably they took advantage of his mental illness to withhold from him the Crown's disclosure of evidence, as is required as the right of any person charged with a criminal offense in Canada. He was convicted, of course, and he went to jail. And because he was classified as a dangerous offender, the jail term he was given was of indefinite duration. That means in jail forever. Mr. Henry maintained that he was innocent and carried on his person a copy of the ridiculous police lineup, the only piece of evidence he had showing the absurdity of his position in jail. Mr. Henry maintained he was innocent, and he made a series of appeal applications, all of which were rejected. Mr. Henry maintained that he was innocent, and he made a series of appeal applications, all of which were rejected. And then, in 2009, new information became available that another man, a different man, had been arrested and convicted for a series of sexual assaults which exactly matched the pattern of assaults that Ivan Henry had been convicted and imprisoned for, and Mr. Henry's appeal was reopened after the recommendation of a special prosecutor who had studied the evidence, and after studying the evidence in a police investigation into 25 unsolved sexual assault cases from the 1980s. In 2010, Ivan Henry was acquitted and released from prison. He had been in prison for 27 years for a series of rapes that he did not commit. Justice Christopher Hinkson wrote in the original ruling of his appeal that Mr. Henry likely would have been acquitted during a trial in 1983 if he had received the disclosure that he was legally entitled to from the Crown. The judge said the Crown's decision to withhold information demonstrated a shocking disregard for Mr. Henry's rights and seriously infringed on his right to a fair trial. It is also likely, this is my opinion, that Mr. Henry would have been acquitted had he had competent legal representation. In Mr. Henry's appeal, the court records indicate that at his trial in 1983, the Crown presented no evidence apart from the eyewitness identification of Ivan Henry by the complainants, recalling that he was identified using a police lineup photo in which 2 uniformed officers held him in a headlock while the other men in the lineup stood casually around. Why not hang a sign around his neck, say, "Pick this guy"? So Mr. Ivan Henry was not acquitted in 2010 on a technicality. He was acquitted because he was obviously innocent. This was an innocent and mentally ill man, falsely convicted of 10 sexual assaults he did not commit and imprisoned for 27 years. After his release, Henry launched a civil suit against the BC provincial government, the federal government, and the city of Vancouver, and he won. And in compensation for his 27 years of imprisonment for crimes he did not commit, he won the modest sum of $8 million. He had his life stolen from him. He is now 70 years old. $8 million. Hooray. And you might think this is where that sad story ends, but it doesn't. In 2015, after Ivan Henry had been awarded $8 million in meager compensation for his 27 years of false imprisonment, he was sued. A group of the victims of the sexual assaults that Ivan Henry went to jail for, despite having not committed those crimes, sued him for access to the small compensation he had won for his wrongful imprisonment. Now, to be fair, you might expect that individuals whose lives had been turned upside down by sexual assault could, in their trauma, easily lose sight of the fact that Ivan Henry was not their attacker, and indeed was himself a victim. Not a victim of sexual assault, which is a single incident, but a victim of continuous imprisonment for 27 years on false grounds. However, it's a bit harder to understand that a professionally run and very well-funded victim services organization would instigate and organize this naked cash grab against a man already horribly victimized. Vancouver's Rape Relief Shelter organized this lawsuit, supplied the former victims with lawyers, and attempted to get standing as a friend of the court for the purpose of re-arguing Mr. Henry's factual innocence and then stealing the money that he received as compensation for his 27 years of unjust imprisonment. And I'm going to restate something, just so that nobody has any possibility of being confused. The man who committed the sexual assaults in the 1980s was caught and convicted in 2005 and is in jail. Nobody is confused that maybe it was actually Ivan Henry and he was acquitted due to some glitch of the law. In 2015, Justice Christopher Hinkson threw out the attempt by Vancouver Rape Relief to argue that a man who had spent 27 years behind bars was actually guilty of sexual assault. The judge threw it out in 2015, and well done. But advanced the clock 2 years to 2017, this year. On the 13th of October this year, 5 of the same former victims who misidentified Ivan Henry from that comically absurd police lineup photograph are suing him again in Canada's Supreme Court, and again with the help of Vancouver's Rape Relief Organization, in another attempt to steal, I say to steal, the $8 million he was compensated for unjust imprisonment for 27 years. And I'll say this again so nobody is confused. The actual rapist who committed these crimes back in 1982 was convicted and imprisoned in 2005. Nobody, and certainly nobody working at Vancouver Rape Relief, is confused that it was actually Ivan Henry. They are suing him to steal from him and his shattered family because he is the easiest and softest target, and now he is a very old man who has had almost his entire life stolen from him and destroyed by his 3 decades of unjust imprisonment. The one potential positive note here, and there is one, is that Vancouver Rape Relief is now very clearly demonstrating to the public and in the media what manner of organization it actually is and what kind of people run it. And if enough people become aware of this information, that evil and corrupt and predatory organization called Vancouver Rape Relief may eventually be defunded and dissolved. There's one other good thing that could come out of this.
The most important thing that could happen in Canada in terms of wrongful convictions would be for an independent body to be created, as has been recommended in 7 commissions of inquiry that will systemically review claims of wrongful conviction across Canada.
An independent body to review and challenge false convictions in this country. Thanks very much for your kind attention, and as always, have a lovely day.